in the year 2021. The African Union said that in order to grow, Africa must silence the guns. We thought we would, but we now know that it is not as easy as we thought it would be. And many young men and women in the continent of Africa are being victimized. Organizations are being formed, which are breeding ground for mercenaries in the Sahelian region. We hear of Boko Haram, we hear of Al-Shabaab, and all these bodies. When you go to the Arab world, you hear of bodies such as Al-Qaeda, which have been operating in countries such as Iraq and in Afghanistan. We hear of the Taliban, and all these are armies that do not respond to a single chain of command.
This is the journey to one Africa.
You know, the conflict in Gaza is a conflict that has generated different reactions, and this is to be understood. We saw this in the early years of the Nakba in 1948. We saw this in 1967 in Yom Kippur. We saw this in 1973. We saw these kinds of reactions in the Intifada. And I note that there have been quite a number of reactions since I made my position known on the ongoing conflict in Gaza. First of all, it's always good to preface a response to reactions with the caveat that nobody has a monopoly of knowledge, nobody has a monopoly of wisdom, that what one does is to share one's perspective with the others in the hope that that enriches the debate. I see a number of comments here about the Balfour Declaration. And it must be remembered that the Balfour Declarations was a series of events beginning, as it were, in 1917, and there were also similar declarations in 1948 that were an offshoot of that declaration. And I can't agree more with those who say that because of the decision at that time, in 1917 initially and 1948 culminating in the creation of what was fundamentally a Jewish state, and the failure of the world at that time to create a Palestinian state, that in many ways has been the genesis of the conflict. So that the Israelis have always been seen by the Palestinians and the Arab neighbors as an occupying force. And many of the wars that have been fought have been on the basis that we are dealing with Israel, which is a Zionist regime, which is an occupying force. And it is in that context that all these attempts that have been made through successive administrations, whether it's Yitzhak Rabin, whether it's Menachem Begin, and a little earlier, even during the reign of the administration of Golda Meir, and of course during the Netanyahu periods, and we saw that all these particular problems have gained the attention of the world, culminating much more prominently in the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords were designed to resolve the problem for all times by creating two states. But that was never to be. We ended up with a Palestinian Authority, and that Palestinian Authority also had its own problems, leading in the bitter fight between the Hamas and Fatah, and with Hamas occupying Gaza. So when we say that the conflict has brought about many non-state actors such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and all these others, we are actually admitting that this is the time that the world should come and say with no equivocation that if we are to resolve the problem in the Middle East, we must have a two-state solution. A two-state solution whose fundamental anchor is that Israel exists and is recognized as such, that Palestine is recognized as such, and they exist side by side, subject to international law. As to whether that will immunize the region from the conflicts that we continue to see, and including the Gaza war, is one that is out for debate. But what has happened and continues to happen in Gaza is creating enmity, which will be difficult to eliminate for generations to come. The other concern that I've seen or response is the question of what has been described as white supremacy. You know, there are those who argue that those who occupy and control Israel are not Jews in the strict sense, that these are white supremacists who are hiding behind the cloak of Jewishness in order to visit pain upon the Palestinians. In fact, I've heard even in the continent of Africa some arguing that the Israelis who are of Caucasian origin are racists, and they have given the example of how they treat the Ethiopian Jews who are brought to Israel under the Operation Moses. There is merit in that, but I think that the question that we ought to preoccupy ourselves with at this time is how to eliminate conflict in the long run. And the way to eliminate conflict, as we have said times without number, is to find a lasting solution. The danger is that we now see a world that is divided, particularly at the political level. In the Western world, everybody, almost to a man, that is to mean politicians, is reluctant to condemn the Israeli response to the activities on the 7th day of October, the year 2023. And those who argue, therefore, because of the European support, the Israelis are thus encouraged. And there are those who, on the other side, are saying that it is important that the organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and we have now seen the Houthis ought to be reined in as a condition precedent to any lasting peace. It is an egg and chicken kind of situation. What do you deal with? The international community through the UN have now said that there is need for a pause or a ceasefire, which will enable the world to look at these issues squarely in the face and find a long-term solution. Whether that is going to happen is another debate. We now see within Israel herself that there are centrifugal forces which say that Prime Minister Netanyahu must find a different approach to the war in Gaza, because the Israeli military thought that it would be a quick fix, but is now appearing that it is for the long haul. So my own view is the sooner Europe and America encourage the Israelis to cease fire with a reciprocal understanding that Hamas and other non-state actors such as Hezbollah and the Houthis will also cease fire so that the world can engage in a constructive way, the safer it is, because the whole world is affected by this war. I see here, for example, I have a comment from my friend Douglas Mochama. And Douglas says, unfortunately, the Hamas has used all its time and energy to radicalize all Gazans to hate their longtime neighbors, Israel. completely true. In fact, it is now argued that every other person in Gaza is being told you have a permanent enemy in Israel. And this is bound to happen. When somebody loses their family in a bombardment, then the only reason why they continue to live is for revenge. And this is one of the reasons why the sooner this war is brought to a halt, the safer everybody is. And I can't agree more with the Douglas Mochama, who takes this view that there is radicalization. And it's not only within Gaza. You can see it even in Lebanon by Hezbollah. You can see it even from the rhetoric that one sees coming out of Yemen through the Houthis. So we are living in quite difficult times, particularly as regards this war. And one must comment that it's a war that affects all of us, because when you interfere with shipping in the Gulf of Aden and in the Red Sea, then everybody suffers. Joseph Hudo, have you asked why Israel has blocked two-state solution? If stateless Palestine can hatch October 7th, then what could happen with the state? Security is Israel's prime fear. They are an existential threat. Secondly, how do you expect Israel to defend itself against rockets launched from hostels, UN facilities, residential homes? Please give an example of how to make the war proportionate. A very, very valid question from Joseph there, because it is very easy to say that this war is not proportionate, the response is not proportionate. And we have had, I'm answering this question by Joseph at a time when the ICJ has pronounced itself on the representation made by the South Africans asking Israel to ensure that genocidal acts are not carried out, effectively just stopping short of saying we need a ceasefire. But I hold the view, which view is capable of being interrogated, that you are safer dealing with a state which is recognized under international law, which is obligated to act in a responsible manner. If you don't have a state, and Palestine is not a state within the understanding of, or within the meaning of international law, then it allows organizations such as Hamas to exist. It allows organizations such as Al-Qassam Brigade. It allows organizations such as Hezbollah. It allows other organizations to operate outside of international law. And when they operate outside of international law, in my view, they are a greater threat to Israel, because the weapons that they acquire are acquired in an irregular manner, and you do not know. But if it was a Palestinian state, which is recognized as such, which acquires arms in a regular way, then they would be under obligation to behave properly. Then they would not use human beings as shields. They would not use civilian facilities for purposes of military action. So to that extent, you are safer with a state which is recognized as such, which exists and which is obligated to respect international law. That is not to say that a state within the meaning of international law does not threaten Israel, but then it is easier to deal with it because you and me know that states are involved in conflict, notwithstanding that they are obligated to act otherwise internationally. Once again, we are not engaged or involved in any mathematics so as to know that this is proportionate and this is not proportionate. But if you look at the rhetoric of the military officers in Israel, or the politicians in Israel, they have said, we are going to fight a war like no other war so that Hamas will never operate. We are going to ensure that Gaza is not habitable. And that is not proportionality. Not easy to argue in favor of, and it is easy from the comfort of our armchairs to argue the way we are arguing, but it's not easy for those who are actually in the theater and the arena of war. You and me can afford the luxury of intellectual and cool analysis, but yet the realities on the ground do not lend themselves to the kind of cool analysis in which we are engaged. A man who calls himself Curious George, and let me speak to your curiosity, Super Curious George. Most of these mistakes make sense, but the point about non-state actors going after civilian target is scary. Make me question the logic. Why can a state actor deem a target necessary for its own political gain, but a non-state actor, which in some of these places and be acting on behalf of their people, cannot go after targets it deems threat? Either countries abide by international law or they don't. You know, the world has known pain. And let us understand, after 1945 war, the so-called World War II, the very reason why the genocide became the focus of international community, and we had a treaty on genocide in 1948 with Israel being the first signatory, was out of what was visited upon the Israelis by the German administration. It is now accepted that nearly 6 billion Jews were targeted because of their race, they were targeted because of their religion. And then the world said, we must never allow this to happen again, no more genocide. And we even said in Geneva in 1949, we even said, even when we conduct war, as human beings somehow accept that war will always exist, we then obligated combatants that even in circumstances when wars are being prosecuted, there are certain things that must not be done. This is the basis of the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949. But even after that, we have seen genocide or genocidal activities. We've seen that in Serbia. We have seen that in places like Rwanda, which tells you that both state and non-state actors tend to conduct themselves in a manner that is inimical to the prescriptions and the injunctions that are placed upon them by law. And this in itself is a sad thing. And that is why we have international institutions which punish such individuals. We saw that with Slobodan Milosevic after the Bosnia War, and we have seen that the very reason why you created the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court is to ensure that those who do not conduct themselves in a manner that is in keeping with the law will be punished in accordance with the law. And we have these permanent institutions because prior to that, you had ad hoc trials, such as the Nuremberg trials, such as the Tokyo tribunals, such as Sierra Leone, such as Rwanda. But we now know better that these institutions, to the extent that is humanly possible, are going to do that. Once again, always easy to argue in the manner that we do, but yet the reality is that it is not easy. I see here, this is a very interesting argument by Samuel. Zion was made by the Ashkenazi, which are from Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Czech, and Australia. There is merit in this, that the Ashkenazis actually are the dominant, but the Sephardims, those who came from Morocco and Northern Africa, really, Israel became a home for all Jews. It is very easy to try and divide the state of Israel as it is now, but the reality is that we are dealing with a state that is recognized as such and which is under existential threat in that part of the world. But what we are telling the Israelis, that there is a solution to this. That solution is two-state. You cannot, in the nature of things, having suffered in the manner that you did under the Holocaust, having been dispersed all over the world, deny another population a right that you yourself are benefiting from. This is what we are saying. And the world will be safer that way. And that, I think, is what the world is telling Israel. Yeah, Julie Okoth, I am very happy you support my views, and I think there is a reason why there is merit in holding the views that we do, because all that we desire is to live in a peaceful environment. All that we have appetite for the continent of Asia and the Middle East and Africa, and indeed is to ensure that we live in an environment that is favorable to all. And this must be understood in the context of the reality in the world, that if there is a war anywhere, it affects all of us. Who, for example, knew that because there is war in the Gaza, there would emerge a Houthi threat that would entail the disruption of maritime activity in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, in the Gulf of Oman, and therefore affect the supply of oil in the world. So all of us really have a duty to ensure that there is security in the world. Somebody is saying a very interesting, I have an idea to end all wars. How about we elect an international president who all leaders of the world have to answer to? The world is now. You know, I believe that we have contributions to make. There was a time when I believed, and I still haven't abandoned this belief, that the occupation of political office gives one a platform to really put into practice what one is saying. But we must remember that we live in a world where the best intentioned of men and women are not necessarily the ones that appeal to the electorate. The electorate is moved by different considerations. Particularly in Africa, the electorate is moved by money. The electorate is moved by ethnicity. And in as much as one would want to be in such a position, one finds oneself in a position where what one can do is to contribute informally. And it is never lost on me personally that some of the people that I'm most attracted to were never occupants of any political office. I'm attracted to the ideas of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, known as Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr., and they became moral forces in the world because it is much more difficult to become a person who is a moral warrior than to be a person who is a political warrior, who is beholden to many interests. But never say never. You never know which voice may call and which voice one may answer to in order to play a much more visible role in the affairs of the world. That is Hilo, who only hides behind the mask 09AZ. But the mask is peeled. You know, the question of the war in Gaza is one that is alive and well. It continues to generate reactions and questions, and in reaction to my sentiment, there are hundreds of questions that have come about, raising pertinent issues. Is two-state solution the solution? How do we deal with non-state actors? What is the nature of the state of Israel? What is the nature of Palestine? What is the role of the international community? What should the International Court of Justice do in the face of the representation by South Africa? Too many questions to answer, but it sends the clear message that the world is concerned, that people are concerned, and that people want a solution to the problem. We will not answer all questions, but we must continue the debate. We must continue to talk about these issues, Because the day we stop talking about them, that is when danger comes in and solutions die. So thank you very much for your comments, those which are interrogative, those which are commendatory, and those which outrightly disagree. The beauty of any debate is that when we disagree, even then, we disagree in an agreeable manner. Thank you. When the World War II was fought, it was said that it would be the war that ends all wars. But after the World War, we have seen many wars of a smaller scale, much more confined to different places in geography, but killing many people and causing chaos throughout the world. It must be noted that when the World War was fought, it was fundamentally an ethnic war within Europe, but the rest of the world was grafted into it. And the continent of Africa was no exception. The continent of Africa found herself in that situation because most of her people had been colonized, and they participated in the war, and they became part of the war and part of a new world order. Today, the creation of the United Nations notwithstanding, the United Nations having been created in 1945 in San Francisco, the United States of America, to be the body that will ensure that the world negotiates itself out of conflict. But that has not happened. In 1948, the world once again sat in Paris, France, to give birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It can't be argued that human rights have injected some kind of distance into human affairs, but that too has had its ups and downs. Once again, a year later, in 1949, in Geneva, Switzerland, the world sat down to bring into being what is called the law of war, to ensure that even in circumstances where war breaks out, it is prosecuted in a manner that is respectful of human beings and human affairs. But today, we find ourselves in a situation where the world is grappling with many issues which have affected peace. Conflict. In Europe, we have seen the breakup of the Soviet Union and the wars that took place thereafter. We saw the Spanish Civil War. In Asia, we saw the wars that took place in India immediately after independence between India and Pakistan. And in 1971, the war between Pakistan and Bangladesh. We have seen the Korean Wars of 1953. In the continent of Africa, we have also seen many wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in the Cameroons, in Central African Republic, in Libya, in Sudan, and we have, of course, seen wars being conducted in Latin America. In a nutshell, the world has seen many conflicts which have given birth to human suffering on a scale that was unprecedented, which then begs the question, how is the world going to immunize ourselves against war? The question that must be asked, is the United Nations capable of ensuring that we do not have war? Continentally, is the African Union capable of ensuring that we do not have war? And the answer is that we find ourselves in a very sorry situation. And the net effect of these is that we are seeing human suffering in proportions that were not contemplated at any one time, with refugees moving within continents, within Europe, within Africa, within Latin America, within Asia. We are seeing hunger in different parts of the world. And this is undermining development with the consequences that the promises we made to ourselves and that we have made to ourselves continentally within the continent of Africa and globally under the aegis of the United Nations, those promises are not being met. We will, for example, remember that we had the Millennium Development Goals. Most of them were not realized. We now have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and in many parts of the world, those are not being realized. In the continent of Africa, we have Africa Agenda 2063, and we are talking about Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But these are being undermined because of the headwinds that we are seeing in the conflict that have been generated. Today, a most unexpected conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Many commentators thought that it would be a short conflict, but 1 year down the line, the conflict continues, and it has affected the distribution of grain throughout the world. Many did not know that Ukraine was responsible for the production of grain in the manner that we now know. And it's not only grain that we are talking about. It has affected the supply of gas to Europe. It has affected the supply of petroleum to the rest of the world. And that has indeed undermined production and increased the cost of living. So that when we talk about the cost of living now, in the first quarter of the 21st century, it is a combination of factors which in itself is leading to a situation that is causing and creating an environment that breeds conflict, and conflict is continuing apace. In the continent of Africa, for example, in the year 2021, the African Union said that in order to grow, Africa must silence the guns. We thought we would, but we now know that it is not as easy as we thought it would be. And many young men and women in the continent of Africa are being victimized. Organizations are being formed which are breeding ground for mercenaries in the Sahelian region. We hear of Boko Haram, we hear of Al-Shabaab. And all these bodies, when you go to the Arab world, you hear of bodies such as Al-Qaeda, which have been operating in countries such as Iraq and in Afghanistan. We hear of the Taliban, and all these are armies that do not respond to a single chain of command. So that one can easily say that there is chaos in the world. Look at what is happening in Haiti, for example. Haiti has now become a haven for warlords, and it is an environment that is toxic, in an environment that is damaging to the futures of and livelihoods of young men and women, and the situation is dire. So in a nutshell, the world finds herself in a situation which she did not contemplate, particularly when we are talking about the 21st century, when we are also talking about the 4th Industrial Revolution and the 5th Industrial Revolution. It beggars belief that in an environment of profound enlightenment, we find ourselves in the most astounding primitivity of man's inhumanity to man. You know, throughout the ages, young people have always been the fuel that lit the fire of change. If you go down in history and you looked at all civilizations, whether it is in Europe of old, it is young people who rose. We remember in Europe in the 1950s and 1960s, and even prior to that, In places such as the Soviet Union with the Bolshevik Revolution, it was young people who were the drivers. If you look at the United States of America, which is part of the so-called New World, it was young people who were in the forefront of the change that took place, both in the struggle for independence and the civil rights movement with people like Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King Jr., John Henry Clark, W.B. Du Bois. If you look at the Caribbean, it's people like Sylvester Williams and individuals such as Marcus Garvey who are pushing the Pan-African movement. And if you come to Latin America, you will find that it was younger people, people like Simon Bolivar, who was responsible for the changes that took place in Latin America, creating in Argentina, in Bolivia, young people. If you come to Asia, once again, it was young people. If you talk about the changes that took place in that part of the world, it was individuals such as Chairman Mao Zedong when they were younger. In India, it was younger people such as Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, who are responsible, and much later people like Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh. In the continent of Africa, if you look at the younger people who are involved in the struggle for independence, Kwame Nkrumah, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Modibo Keita, Ahmed Ben Bella, Samora Moises Machel, Agostino Neto, you can count many of them. And critically, you see that in any country, we now talk, for example, of the Young Turks. Many people forget that it was in those days of Atatürk of Turkey that the Young Turks emerged and created what we now know as modern Turkey. In China, in Tiananmen Square, in Korea, the 1980s changes, in South Africa, the independence movement I've already talked about, but go to South Africa, the Sharpeville massacre, go to that same South Africa, the Soweto rebellions and all these. So young people have to recognize, particularly young people in the continent of Africa now, that if Africa is to know change, and this is not only applicable to young Africans, it's applicable to young Europeans, it is applicable to young Asians. It is the synergy that will be created amongst young people, the cohabitation of well-meaning efforts by young people that is going to change the world. And the world must change. Nobody is going to live in silos. The octogenarian politicians that we now have who are ruling the roost, the only way that we are going to remove them is by creating a network of young people throughout the world who are not going to be persuaded to do the right things out of racism, creed, religion, or ethnicity. And it can be done. The spirit that led to the creation of the United Nations in 1945 was a defying spirit. The spirit that led to the creation of the non-aligned movement when people in Yugoslavia, such as Josip Broz Tito, Jawaharlal Nehru in India, and Gamal Abdel Nasser in the Arab world, and Kwame Nkrumah in Africa, when they met, they only said that there was one humanity. And I remember Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe saying in 1960, there is only one race, the human race. And that, to me, is what the younger people ought to be talking about going forward. Because if they take that path, then we can meaningfully expect that the wars we have, which are affecting the entire world, will then be a thing of the past. Today, nobody can afford to live in silos. And if you ever doubted that reality, see what happened with COVID. When it started in China, we thought that it would not go to the rest of the world, but it did. And who are responsible for it? Young people. Young people. And that's why I agree with Mwalimu Julius Nyerere when he said in 1967, the secret to development is having young men and women who are well brought up, young men and women who have vision, young men and women who are prepared to sacrifice to ensure that they create a sustainable environment for their generation and generations yet to be born. You know, I'm speaking at a time when the world is under no illusions. If anybody thought that the war in Ukraine was too remote, too alien, they now know better. They now know that the bread that is eaten in Egypt, they now know that the bread that is eaten in Garowe in Somalia, that the bread that is eaten in Nairobi, Kenya, is made out of grain from Ukraine. And that therefore you cannot ignore that war. We now know that when Russia and Ukraine are fighting, then it will affect the cost of fuel. And if it affects the cost of fuel, then it will affect the cost of commodities which we use on a daily basis. We now know that it will affect the world's supply chain, and the things that we take for granted will be disrupted. Therefore, we have a keen interest, and Africa must have a keen interest, and it gladdens my heart that the African Union has now decided to send a peace delegation to Moscow and to Kiev to talk to the leaders of the combating parties to bring peace. And I hope that Africa will begin to rise as a continent that can midwife peace, because peace is critical to African development in all its aspects, and history has demonstrated not once, not twice, but times without number, that indeed the world is but a global village, and a war in what you think is geographically a distant land affects you in a very practical and real-time way. I've always held the view that when a house is on fire, you put out the fire. You don't try to determine who lit the fire in the first place. And we find ourselves in such a situation. And the question as to who is right and who is wrong depends on who you are talking to. If you talk to the Western world and the Ukrainians, they hold the view that Russia is the aggressor. And they are therefore actually fighting this war. The reality of this war is that Russia is fighting the entire Western world. That is the reality. Many African countries quietly actually support Russia. And they support Russia out of historical reasons, that at critical moments during the struggle for independence, it is the Russians who came out to support those who are fighting for independence. The Russians who are present in Congo, the Russians who are present during the struggle in South Africa, the Russians who are present in Mozambique, the Russians who are present in Angola, the Russians who are present in Guinea-Bissau, and therefore sentimentally, Africans support Russia. But no matter who we support, my own view is that war has no eyes. The net effect is that those who are not responsible for the war end up suffering. And I hope that this war, once it's settled, will send a clear message also to the Western world that their hegemonic approach to world affairs must come to an end, and that the era of unilateralism and manipulation of multilateral institutions must stop, and the approach to world affairs must be collegiate through the UN. If they don't do that, then the Western world will find itself in a very difficult position, and the only thing that will protect them from the rest of the world is that they have nuclear weapons which they can unleash upon the rest of the world. And the writing is on the wall. If you look at the world today, and the dollar has been the dominant currency in the world. And the dollar's dominance came about in the 1960s, 1970s, perhaps a little earlier. But the dollar became the hegemonic currency when they entered into an arrangement with the Saudis, and we then gave the world, or they gave the world, the term petrodollar. So that what then started happening is that the dollar was no longer backed by any gold. The dollar became a fiat currency during the Nixonian era. Oh, I'm saying era and era at the same time. It was an era and an era at the same time. And almost all transactions in the world are terminated in the dollar. And they have used the dollar as an instrument of political and economic control, and that is coupled with the use of institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. And you remember, the World Bank and the IMF were created in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States in 1944 by American economists and British economists at that time, as a way of finding funds and deploying funds for the rebuilding of Europe after the World War II. But when African countries became independent, we also found ourselves in that space. So when you hear people saying we want to de-dollarize, they are actually saying we want total independence. And total independence means economic emancipation. People are saying we have been manipulated for too long. We've been controlled for too long. The Americans can print dollars and deploy them anywhere in the world. And it is suggested that nearly 40% of the American dollars is actually circulating outside of the United States of America. So that even when America says that they are the most heavily indebted nation on earth, they are not. In fact, they can just print dollars and pay their debts. So this is a cry by the world that we want change, that freedom must mean that we are capable of trading at levels which are equal, that we can run our affairs without being dictated to. As I speak to you now, if you are in Nouakchott in Mauritania and you want to send money to somebody in Abidjan in La Côte d'Ivoire, the correspondent bank will be in the United States of America or in Paris. How can that be allowed to happen? And then we talk about the sovereignty of the nation. I hear that cry, and I too am a warrior in that struggle. The warrior to de-dollarize and have a completely reconfigured architecture of the world economy. And that is why BRICS, which is now bringing together new countries that are emerging out of the domination of the United States of America, is beginning to make sense. China is in that arrangement. India is in that arrangement. Brazil is in that arrangement. Russia is in that arrangement. South Africa is in that arrangement. And let me tell you, in the next few years, you will see many countries coming into that arrangement with the sole purpose of ensuring that their economies are de-dollarized. And I want to say, part of the reason why you see our economies cannot grow as well and as robustly as they should is because they are shadow economies being controlled like marionettes from Washington, London, Paris, Brussels, and those Western countries. The conflicts that we see, particularly the Russia-Ukraine war, if not stopped, has the potential of spreading to the rest of the world. Remember that the combatants in this particular war are Western European countries and Russia. And all these countries have military bases in the continent of Africa. And if one mistake is made and it degenerates into a nuclear war, nobody will be spared. And indeed, that is the reason why the African Union and African leaders have now said we can no longer afford the luxury of sitting back. We must come into the forefront and send a peace mission. They realize, as we say in Kiswahili, if your neighbor is having a haircut, you must also take water and put it on your hair, because it is your hair that is next online. And I hope that the African initiative will succeed, because if it does, it will do a number of things. One, it will, number one, demonstrate that Africa is capable of midwifing peace processes. Number two, it will be a message to the Western world that they can no longer dictate to the world what the world needs to do. Number three, it will force the international community through the agency of the United Nations Organization to renegotiate the character and composition of critical institutions of the UN going forward. Also, as it is now, the UN is a body that functions at the behest of the Western world, and others are mere participants playing what sometimes in English may be called the gooseberry, as an unwanted third parties in the entire arrangement. That is why you see international institutions such as the ICC, institutions that sometimes are deployed to deal with those whom America or the British or Europe do not like to operate in a particular way. So I look forward to the quick end of this war, that we start a healing period which is defined by rapprochement.
This is the journey to one Africa.